This kitty has a side quest for me, and it's through this door. Okay. Yes, sir. Alright. Ew, it's dark in here. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Winter is around the corner, so I'm getting this old Miata ready for sleep. Yep. I gotta do a suspension job on this car. All four corners. The shocks are just gone. You think they'd last longer than 26 years, but I guess not, right? Yeah. The bushings are fine, and the control arms, and there's really everything is nice and solid underneath. No rust. Nothing like that. Not like a typical New England car, but actually it looks brand new underneath. Pretty damn close to it. But those shocks, man. Oh boy. Going down the highway and it's like doing one of these. Maybe we should crack open the old wallet and give this poor car some fiscal love. And water spots. And a nice fluff and buff. Yeah. That's all she needs. On to more pertinent things. Okay. So, when we left off, I think I had just degreased the engine. And we got it degreased, we got it cleaned and pressure washed, and then I went and hauled off and I coated the engine with some, I think I used liquid wrench, which has a nice, liquid wrench, by the way, has the worst smell. Oh my God, the worst odor. It is so bad when it gets into your clothes. It was awful. The horrible, horrible smell of liquid wrench. Anyway. So, I was going to do a video on this, and that's kind of what we're doing. We're kind of doing a quick little update. I was going to do a whole video on lapping the valves, or grinding the valves. Well, let me explain what that means. So, the valves are, and they should be in a bag here. So, whenever you have an engine apart this far, it's a good practice, I think. I could be wrong on this, but, you know, everybody's got their opinions, and, you know. So, my thought is, it's not a bad idea to check to make sure the valves are properly seating. In that, it's my intake, yeah. In that, when the valve is in the closed position, it is a gas-tight seal all around between the valve face and the valve seat. And the way to do that is to see this grittiness here. I don't like that. I'm going to explain something. I've never ground valves before. I watched a couple of videos on how to do it. I watched my dad do it back when I was a kid, and it seemed like a pretty straightforward process. You get yourself some valve grinding compound and a valve lapping tool. And you just put the tool right on the valve head, and you go like this. You know, normally the suction cup head of this tool will stick to the valve through the force of vacuum, and it will cause that valve to spin in place like that. Okay? But the problem is, the valves on this engine are not made in a way that allows this tool to work. The surface is rough, and there's dimples. So I believe on this particular valve, these were designed to be used with a special tool that sits into these two dimples, and it allows the valve to spin. But what you're doing is you're using a heavy abrasive, or it has a very gritty feel to it. I think it's like silica sand and some kind of a polishing paste or something. And you put it on the surface of the valve face, and you just spin it in place, just as I showed there a minute ago. You spin it in place, and what it's doing is it's grinding away at the material on both sides, on both the valve face and the valve seat, and it's grinding them together so that they are the exact, so they fit together, and they have a nice gas-tight seal between the two surfaces. Now, what would cause? Let's backtrack a bit. What would cause the valves to no longer have a nice tight seal? Well, sometimes these two surfaces can become built up with grit. They can get built up with carbon. Over time, sometimes the valves can, if the valves ever overheat or they burn, they can become warped, at which point you'd replace it with a new valve. But that new valve isn't going to necessarily mate up with the valve seat. And that's when you really need to grind you have to grind, of course, the new valves in so that they seal up properly. But pretty much, as the engines age and they wear, and the valves no longer properly seal, you can end up with a problem. Now, the other thing is, by grinding the valves, you can also determine if there's a problem with the valve itself. So after grinding, you should see, and this is perfect. This actually did come out pretty good. You should have a nice, smooth and consistent gray band on the valve face, and the valve seat should look like it was freshly cut, and it does. So I am confident that these valves are going to seal just fine. There was never a problem to begin with. But by grinding the valves, I can now see visually, okay, yes, it's seating correctly, everything should be just fine. Both the exhaust and the intake valve are looking pretty good. I have a nice consistent band, nice fresh cut gray band all along the exhaust valve. So I was able to successfully grind the valves, but I didn't do it the right way. I had to think and scramble for an alternative method because the tool that I have wouldn't do the job. So I took this punch and I kind of spun the valve like this while putting a little bit of pressure on it, not much, and then alternating the holes so that I'm not grinding it on just one particular side. I'm using both holes to even the score a little bit. Not the right way to do it. I know that for a fact, but that's what I have at my disposal. Again, looking at the valves, I can see that the valve seats look pretty healthy. Everything looks really healthy, but this created a new problem. So I now have valve grinding compound that managed to get down into the valve stem or the valve guides, and I have to flush all of that out. So I'm going to take the engine. Once again, I'm going to bring it outside and get some brake cleaner, and I'm going to flush out as much of this as I can. It got down to the camshaft. So at this rate, I should probably pull the camshaft out, but I don't feel any of that stuff down here. So I think if I flush it out with brake cleaner, I'll be okay. The thing is, valve grinding compound is an abrasive, and it can destroy the bearings in an engine. If it gets in the wrong place, it can absolutely annihilate the engine. So I'm going to do some precautions. I'm going to flush it all out, and then I'm going to change the oil a couple of times after I get it running. I'll let it run for a little while, then I'll change the oil. Then I'll run it again, change the oil. Not a lot of oil in that sump, so I'm not too concerned about that. So that's where we're at. I did grind the valves. They look good. They feel good. So I want to talk a little. So this is a little bit of information for those of you who don't really have a lot of experience or knowledge with small and actually just any engine in particular, or any engines at all. So if you're not too familiar with the workings of a 4-cycle engine, I'm going to give you a little bit of information on this. So let's talk a little bit about what valves are, how they work, and what happens when things go wrong, and how those things can happen. But first, we need to start with a little bit of parts identification. All right, so we'll start off with the valve. Okay, this is an intake valve. It's on the intake side of the engine. So this valve allows the air and fuel mixture to enter the combustion chamber during the intake cycle. The exhaust valve allows that burned fuel and air mixture to safely exit the engine during the exhaust cycle. This is the valve face right here. This is the part that we're talking about that we're grinding. The valve stem. And then this end of this little milled section on the end here, this is where the valve retainers clip into. You've got your valve spring. There's one per valve. And that's true for any engine. There's going to be a valve spring. And down inside the engine, you've got your camshaft. Now this is what they call a flathead or L-head engine. And L-head engines have their camshafts inside the block. This is also true for pushrod engines that are used in some automotive and truck engines, although that's not really a thing anymore. So this is our camshaft. Now you'll notice, so those eccentric, looks like teardrop-shaped pieces of metal, those are what you call your cam lobes. And they're pressing up against the camshaft followers. The follower takes the brunt of the abuse from the camshaft lobe, and it transfers that up and down movement to the bottom of the valve stem, pushes it up and down. Those are also known as tappets, lifters, followers. Depends on what kind of engine you're talking about and who you're talking to. A lot of those terms are misapplied, but I think the correct term in this instance is those are your lifters. Now, getting into the weeds a little bit, on an automotive engine, for example, those lifters are self-adjusting hydraulic lifters. So what they do is they automatically adjust for wear and tear on the engine, normal wear and tear within the valve train, as well as thermal expansion and contraction of the metals in the engine. And what they do is they automatically fill up with oil, which acts as kind of like a liquid shim. So if there's too much valve play being the space between the camshaft lobe and the bottom of the valve stem here, there's a lot of play in there. So when the valve is being lifted by the camshaft, it hits, it strikes it. And that's an audible ticking sound. If you start your car on a cold morning and you hear a ticking sound, like a tick, 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 tick. My Miata does that on occasion, and that's normal for that car. It happens to all of them. But that ticking sound, tick, 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 that'll eventually go away if, in the case of a hydraulic lifter, it will fill up with oil and take up that space automatically. So it's a nice, tight, so it's like this rather than like this. I'm exaggerating a lot here. We're talking fractions of a thousandth of an inch here. It's all it takes to create a noisy engine, though. Now, this is what they call a solid lifter engine. On an engine like this, if there's excessive valve play and it's tapping, tap, 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 like that, then there are mechanical means of adjusting and shimming that lifter. I believe in this case you would have to put a thicker lifter in. I'm not really sure how on this model engine that's handled. I don't know if there's a shim that can go on the lifter, or if there's some other means of adjusting for valve play. This is all going somewhere, by the way. I assure you. If you're not following me, find there's other channels that have better descriptions of what I'm trying to lay down here. Okay, So why is it important to grind the valves? Very simple. As we discussed earlier, in order to produce a nice tight seal between the valve face and the valve seat. All right. On this engine, the valve seats on the exhaust and intake ports are different. The intake port is milled. The seat is actually milled into the surface of the block here. It's a precision process done at the factory. On the exhaust side, however, they've elected to use a different material, probably a much higher heat-resistant steel rather than cast iron, because the cast iron is more brittle and is more susceptible to damage under high heat circumstances and mechanical stresses. So they've got what is a replaceable valve seat that is pressed into the surface of the deck here, and that's cut on a machine, probably in another process, before it's installed. And those are your valve seats. Okay. On this particular engine, if the valve seat were to wear out completely, you would essentially scrap the entire block. On the exhaust side, you could replace the valve seat, in theory. Okay. So it's important that not only for the sake of a gas tight seal on the compression stroke for the valve seat and the valve face to be perfectly machined to each other, but it's also important for heat dispersion, especially on the exhaust valve. The exhaust valve exhausts all that hot combustion gases. All the hot gases come out through this side. And in doing so, it causes the valve to heat up. You'll notice that this exhaust valve is made from a different material altogether. This is probably a patented blend of metal or alloy. This is a Thompson Silchrome. If you look it up, it actually is a thing. Thompson Silchrome. This is probably a high chromium content or something. I don't know what that means. But what it means is this is made from probably a much stronger metal. It probably behaves differently under high heat. I digress. So as the valve exhausts hot gases, it heats up tremendously, especially under a load when the engine's really working its little heart out. And in order for that heat to go, that heat has to go somewhere. So during the compression stroke, as well as the intake stroke, it gives the exhaust valve a little bit of time to mate with the block. And that split second between cycles, between exhaust cycles, is enough for the heat from this super hot valve head to dissipate into the block and get carried out through the normal cooling process. Same with the intake valve. So right now, our exhaust valve is idle and cooling, and now the intake valve and the exhaust valve are idle and cooling, sending their heat into the block. Oh, exhaust stroke. Exhaust valve heats up from the exhaust gases. Time to cool. And the intake valve is actually cooled by the intake airstream and the fuel vapor, which actually helps cool the intake valve off, but it also requires some cooling time. So, I think you understand how the valves cool off and why it's important. Oh wait, we didn't get to that, did we? Why is it important that these valves have time to cool? And yes, in order for them to cool properly, they must have a properly milled mating surface. And they must be adjusted properly. Case in point. If your valves are adjusted too tightly, be it on an 85-year-old lawnmower engine or a 6-month-old Lexus, it doesn't matter. The principles are still the same. if the valves are improperly adjusted, they will never, or if the surfaces are not properly milled and the valves aren't properly ground, you will never get a complete solid contact between the two surfaces. So if the valves are adjusted too tightly, that being there is not enough clearance between the camshaft lobe, the tappet, the follower, or the lifter, whatever you want to call it, and the valve stem, what's going to happen is the valve will either not contact the deck for the duration of time it's needed to, or it'll never contact it completely at all. And that creates a situation where the valve can overheat and what they call burn, a burned valve. You might have heard that term before from your mechanic. What a burned valve is a valve that was never, it could have been done at the factory, or it could have been due to, in the case of an engine that requires manual valve adjustments, the so-called shim and bucket system on automobile engines, or in this case of this engine, they put the wrong lifter in there and adjusted it improperly. What can happen is the valve will overheat. It will get so hot that it will lose its temper. And this metal is heat treated. So if it reaches a temperature beyond the heat treatment, what the heat treatment will provide, the metal can go soft. It can deform, it can warp, even a less than a fraction of a thousandth of an inch is all it takes sometimes to cause the metal, or to cause the valve to lose its shape. Not necessarily its shape, but it can warp and bend ever so slightly. Just enough to cause that valve to either no longer seal. In the case of a burnt valve engine, it'll be so bad. In a single cylinder engine, it may not run at all. But in a 4-cylinder engine or a multi-cylinder engine, it'll run poorly, and you're going to end up with an inconsistent exhaust stream. It's kind of an interesting test. If you've got an engine with a burned valve, and it's a multi-cylinder engine, so it'll still run despite having one cylinder that isn't firing anymore because of the burned valve situation, take a piece of paper to the exhaust. If it's a burned exhaust valve, and it usually almost always is, what will happen is that piece of paper will momentarily get sucked towards the exhaust pipe on the intake stroke. As the intake stroke will draw air not only from the intake valve, but from the exhaust valve as well, because it's not sealing properly. What happens if you burn a valve? Sometimes you can get lucky and you can just grind the shit out of it and maybe bring some more life to it. But more often than not, you're going to be replacing that one bad valve. And valves aren't something that you have to replace in pairs. You just replace the one that's bad. If you've got one that's bent, you just replace the bent valve. In the case of an engine that it was assembled out of time, if I put this engine together back, well, you wouldn't have this on an overhead valve or a flathead engine, but on a modern engine, if you break a timing belt or a timing chain, or the engine jumps time and you bend a valve, you can just replace the one bad valve and you'll be on your way. And the way to check for that bent valve sometimes is to try grinding it and see what happens. Yeah. Now, since we're having a conversation about valves, I'll talk about what excessive clearance can do. If the valves have excessive clearance, meaning that there's too much of a gap, let's pretend that my knuckle is the cam lobe, and let me see if I can get this right. So as I'm raising the valve up, and then it drops down. Let's say this is the bottom, this is the lowest point of the cam, and there's a little bit of a gap there, but too much of a gap. There should be a gap. There should always be a gap, just enough to allow for the expansion of the valve stem, and because you don't want a situation, like I said, with a burned valve, or what can cause a burned valve, is not enough clearance. So you got to have some kind of a gap there. for the valve to completely close when hot. But let's say there's too much of a gap. What's going to happen is you're going to get a tapping sound. If it's just one valve, it'll happen every other revolution of the crankshaft. If it's both valves, it'll happen on every revolution of the crankshaft. So that's in a single cylinder engine. We don't want to go too far into this, but too much of a gap can cause a problem where the valves don't properly open. They don't open enough, depending on how big the gap is or how far out of whack we're talking. If the valves don't open all the way, the engine won't run as efficiently. It'll be starving for air. If it's the exhaust valve and the valve isn't opening, because I mean we're talking as that camshaft is coming up to it, it's designed so that valve starts opening almost immediately. But if that opening is delayed too much, you can create a restriction on the exhaust side, or a starvation of air-fuel mixture on the intake side, in addition to an annoying tapping noise. But it's even worse because that tapping noise also means that you're causing excessive mechanical wear on the valve train. Small engines like this, however, aren't as sensitive to these issues because they're not used at high revolution or high speed barreling down the highway. So you can run an engine like this. As long as the valves are closing properly, they'll run forever. As long as the valves are, as long as they're closing, and as long as that valve clearance isn't so bad that it sounds like it's flying apart. The engine like this is probably going to make a lot of valve clatter. I can tell you that right off. I mean, you can tell right now. So even with the springs disconnected, I can tell you that. See, this is how much I have. Yeah, there's about one tooth on the camshaft free play on either direction. Is that good? I don't know. I should take a feeler gauge and actually check. Where would I check? Well, I would take my feeler gauge and I stick it between the camshaft lobe and the, I'll show you. You're going to want to stick your feeler gauge between the camshaft lobe at its bottom, right here, and right about here. But you're going to want to do that with the valve springs in place just to give you a better reading. And that will tell you how much clearance you have, or how much valve lash. Valve lash is the term you're going to find most likely in the manual. But that'll tell you how much clearance you have between the camshaft lobe. That's where that's where it matters. And I'm not sure, but I think there are shims you can buy for these engines. I don't really know. I've never done a valve adjustment on a small engine before. At least I'm honest about it. I'm not going to lie and say I did it and not really mean it. But I don't know where the shims would go in an engine like this, if such a thing exists. I think they just kind of, as long as it meets a certain criteria, it's within spec, and just run with it. If not, just leave it alone and just run with it. I hope this has been somewhat informative. I'm not a teacher. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a quick little rundown on how valve trains work, how they can fail, and why, and how you can prevent that. But it always goes down to proper maintenance. Number one, make sure that your cooling fins are clean. Don't allow your cooling fins to get plugged up with grass and dirt. On my lawnmower, which is in the basement now, I put it away for the season. On my lawnmower, every couple of uses, I actually spray a garden hose into the flywheel while the engine is running, to flush out all sorts of stuff. Dust, grass, leaves, whatever. And it keeps it nice and clean. I've never heard an engine doing that. And then I run it a little bit longer. I keep it running. Just kind of, I'll even put a zip tie on the handle and just let the engine run to burn off any moisture and make sure that it doesn't rust up or anything like that. I've always done that. I've never had an engine fail doing that. If you know, you just, on an air-cooled engine, this is all you got for cooling. Just whatever air is produced by the flywheel fins and whatever air can pass through these fins here. The other thing I'll do is I'll make sure that my oil is changed regularly. Staving off oil changes on a small engine. Remember, these engines don't have filters. even the lawnmower engine you just bought from Lowe's, there's no oil filters in these things, so changing the oil on a regular basis is critical. I wanted to mention this in a separate video, but I'm going to mention it here since we're kind of on the same tangent, small engine maintenance. I have one of those new Briggs and Stratton engines that requires no oil changes. You don't ever need to change the oil. It's good for life. What they don't tell you is the life of that lawnmower is directly tied to the lack of oil changes. I changed the oil. You know, they don't say you can't change the oil. They just say you don't have to. It's maintenance free. Just add oil when needed. I drained the oil out of that lawnmower after one season. One season. And it was the dirtiest oil I've ever seen come out of a small engine. Ever. It was disgusting. I could not believe how bad it was. Look, don't believe the hype. Fill for life engine oil on a lawnmower is absolute bullshit. Do not buy one of these machines and think you're going to get away with not changing the oil. That engine will fail after just a couple of seasons. It guaranteed. I can only guarantee that it will fail. It will not last 10 years. If you're used to your mowers lasting 10 years, do not follow those guidelines. I should have kept a sample of it. In fact, no, I didn't. The oil was disgusting. It was as bad as break-in oil could ever be. So I changed it. I put fresh, whatever the hell it called for. I think it was SA. Actually, I think on that engine it was 5W30 was a synthetic, was a good oil for that motor. And that's what I used. But don't believe the hype about the Fill for Life fluids. Even on your cars. I have a car, my Hyundai Santa Fe. Fill for Life transmission fluid. Never needs changing. Bullshit. I actually had it changed. And not only did it improve shifting performance, but it gave me the peace of mind knowing that it's probably going to last a lot longer. But everybody's doing this. It's a marketing gimmick. That's all it is. These engines can be maintained. And, you know, the other thing is air filters. So many people don't change the air filters in their mowers these days. They just, and then when it dies, they bring it somewhere and they pay them a bunch of money to change the air filter. Oh, my mower died. It won't start. What do I do? Oh, we'll bring it on in. And what are they going to do? Change the air filter and charge you for a service call, which I think is quite expensive, about $100 or so or more. The air filter cost me $12 at my local hardware store. Pop it on, good to go for another season. Change the oil. Spark plugs, spark plugs can probably go about 2 or 3 seasons or more, depending on the size of your lawn. I used to change them every season, but they're really never that bad, especially on a small little motor like this. What I do is I just clean them, put them back in, and then when they start to get warm, when the electrodes start to wear out, they start to round off a little bit, then I'll put new ones in. But yeah, not to get too far away from the subject at hand, this little antique guy. But the thing is that really bothers me about modern engines. And this started, I think, in the 90s. They started making camshafts out of plastic. The entire camshaft and the cam gear are made of, I believe, nylon. And they're ticking time bombs, regardless of maintenance. And some Hondas are using an oil lubricated timing belt on their mower engines, and those have been known to fail too. But not the belt. It's not the belt that fails. It's the plastic. The plastic timing gears actually go bad on those, from what I've read. Scary stuff. You'll never see anything like this made ever again. And it's a sad thing, too. This thing is 85 years old, and it has another 85 years of life left in it. After we get this thing back together again, we put our new piston rings in there, get it up and running, put new gaskets. I have parts on order. I ordered the new old stock points and condenser. Actually, I got a new condenser. You don't want old stock condensers. They go bad with time. But I got a new points set. I got the gaskets I need. I got... What else did I buy? I think I got a new gas cap. The gas cap is bad, so I think I ordered one of those. Just a few odd... Oh, and I also got a new bowl seal for the Tillotson fuel separator. I got a new seal for this because I know that's going to be bad. Just got all the parts I think I'm going to need for a successful build, and we'll have this thing up and running in a jiff. It shouldn't take too much. I got some rope for the starter cord. I'm going to make a handle. I'm going to make an oak starter handle for this engine. We'll do another video on that. It's going to be a nice little custom job. And I got some scrap oak down in the basement I can use, and I'll shellac it and make it look pretty. Get some stain shellac. I got paint on order. I found Duplicolor makes a hunter green engine paint. You just can't buy it in the stores. No stores sell this paint. It's hard to find. So I ordered that. That should be in this week or maybe early next week. So I still need to get a new head bolt. What I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to take my the bolts that I do have. I'm going to try to find replacements for some of these bolts. No, actually, I should probably buy the correct ones. But the one that broke, unfortunately, I don't have. Yeah, I don't have anything like it. This one actually, no, you know what? These washers, I think they're a separate part. So, yeah, I'm going to have to do some hardware shopping, for sure. And maybe I can just get something off the shelf at my local hardware store. Probably, what, a grade 8 bolt or something like that? Yeah. Anyway, so we'll get some bolts. Just one. I only need the one. So, fun times, guys. It's going to be fun. I can't wait. I'm not worried about the exhaust right now. Once I get the engine running, I'll put an exhaust on it. I don't need to put an exhaust on it right now to get it going. It's not like it's going to blow it up or anything. It'll still run without a muffler. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to just run it as it sits, and hopefully. What is this? Not quite. It's like a 30 degree or something like that. Elbow. We might be able to reuse this elbow. All we need is a short pipe and a little stub to come off of here. And then I'll take this off. I'll try to take this off. And that'll be for the the new muffler. We'll screw it into that. All right. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.